Jake Mitchell had always been the kind of guy who thought he had everything figured out. As a senior at Riverview High School, he was riding high on the privileges of popularity, athletic success, and being the son of a wealthy businessman. His friends idolized him, his teachers overlooked his occasional arrogance, and his coaches praised him as the captain of the basketball team. Life for Jake was simple, and he liked it that way. On a typical Thursday afternoon, Jake sauntered down the crowded hallways of Riverview High, his backpack slung over one shoulder. His friends Carter, Sam, and Kyle were right behind him, cracking jokes and talking about the upcoming basketball game that weekend. Jake barely had to look up to know he'd be greeted with nods of acknowledgement from students passing by, as if he were some kind of local celebrity. He thrived on it. He had an easy confidence that radiated from him, a natural aura that drew people in. But there was something else that came with that confidence, a sense of entitlement. Jake didn't consciously think of himself as better than anyone else, but he acted like it, often without realizing. He couldn't help but see the people around him through a filter of status, who mattered and who didn't. And the janitors? The cafeteria staff? The quiet kids in the back of the classroom? They barely registered in Jake's world. They were just background noise. As Jake and his friends rounded a corner, they passed by Mr. Thompson, the school janitor, who was sweeping the floors just outside one of the classrooms. Thompson was a familiar sight, always quietly going about his work, rarely drawing attention to himself. To Jake, Thompson was just an old man in an ugly, faded uniform, pushing a broom around a building full of teenagers. "Man, look at this guy," Jake muttered, nudging Carter as they passed. "Can you imagine being stuck cleaning up after a bunch of kids your whole life? Must be pretty sad, huh?" Carter chuckled, not really engaging, but enough to egg Jake on. Sam and Kyle followed suit, laughing along, even though none of them paid much attention to what they were actually laughing at. They were Jake's crew, his sidekicks, and their job was to follow his lead, whatever direction that took. Jake, feeling a rush of superiority, couldn't resist taking things further. He glanced back at Thompson, who continued to sweep the hallway without looking up. Jake's smile turned into a smirk. "Hey, Thompson," he called out, loud enough for the janitor to hear. "You missed a spot back there. You need me to show you how it's done." His friends burst into louder laughter, and Jake basked in the attention. He expected Thompson to react, maybe with annoyance, maybe with a snide remark, something that would justify the mocking. But Thompson didn't give him the satisfaction. He simply paused for a moment, adjusted his grip on the broom, and resumed sweeping as if Jake and his friends didn't exist. Jake frowned, feeling an odd irritation rise in his chest. He didn't like being ignored, especially not by someone like Thompson. A janitor, for God's sake. What did the guy have to be so calm about? But Thompson's silence unnerved him, so Jake shrugged it off and continued down the hall with his friends, quickly moving on to talking about weekend plans and forgetting all about the brief encounter. Still, something about the janitor's unflinching reaction lingered in the back of Jake's mind, even as the day went on. The following day, during his last period, Jake sat in history class, his mind wandering. His teacher, Mrs. Freeman, was in the middle of a lesson about the Vietnam War, but Jake wasn't paying attention. His thoughts were elsewhere, mostly on the basketball game that weekend. They were playing against their biggest rival, Westbrook High, and Jake was eager to lead his team to another victory. His scholarship to state was all but secured, but every game was an opportunity to solidify his reputation as the school's golden boy. "Jake." Mrs. Freeman's voice snapped him back to the present. "I asked if you'd read the next section for us." Jake blinked, glancing around the room as his classmates stifled their laughter. He grabbed the textbook in front of him, flipping to the right page. He wasn't really embarrassed, this happened all the time, but he could tell Mrs. Freeman wasn't amused. He read the passage aloud, his voice flat and uninterested, before she continued with her lecture. As the clock ticked closer to the end of the period, Mrs. Freeman made an announcement. "Tomorrow, we'll have a special guest speaker in class," she said, glancing around at the students. "He's a veteran who served in Vietnam, and he's going to share some of his experiences with us. I expect you all to show the utmost respect." Jake barely registered the words. A veteran speaker? sounded like another boring history lecture to him. He figured it would be just another day of tuning out and daydreaming about basketball. He couldn't have cared less about a war that had happened long before he was even born. When the bell rang, he packed up his things and left class without a second thought. The next morning, Jake arrived at school feeling the usual rush of energy. The sun was shining, and there was a palpable excitement in the air for the upcoming basketball game. He swaggered down the hallway, high-fiving his teammates as they passed by, laughing as they joked about Westbrook High's weak defense. When he entered the history classroom, he noticed something different. The desks were arranged in a semicircle, and there was a chair set up at the front of the room for the guest speaker. Jake took his usual seat near the back, slouching comfortably, expecting another dull presentation. Mrs. Freeman entered the room, looking more serious than usual. "Class, please settle down. I want to introduce our guest speaker for today, a man who served this country with distinction during the Vietnam War. Please welcome Sergeant William Thompson." Jake's head jerked up at the sound of the name. He stared in disbelief as Mr. Thompson, the janitor, walked into the classroom. His plain clothes and humble demeanor were the same as always, but there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. The students, who usually paid little attention to the janitor, now watched him in silence. Jake's initial reaction was confusion. Mr. Thompson? The janitor? The man who swept floors and cleaned up messes every day? Jake's brain struggled to reconcile the image of Thompson with the idea of a war hero. There had to be some kind of mistake. Thompson took a seat at the front of the room, his posture straight, his face calm. "Thank you for having me," he said, his voice steady but not loud. "I'm not one for giving speeches, but your teacher asked me to talk a little bit about my time in the military, so I'll do my best." Jake felt an odd mix of emotions. Part of him still wanted to laugh, to make a joke about how ridiculous this all seemed. But another part, the part that had noticed how Thompson had ignored his taunts the other day, kept him quiet, waiting. Thompson began by talking about how he enlisted in the Army when he was 19 years old, just a few months after graduating high school. He explained how, like many young men at the time, he didn't fully understand what he was signing up for. He didn't know much about Vietnam or the politics behind the war, but he felt a sense of duty, a pull to serve his country. Jake listened, almost in spite of himself. There was something about the way Thompson spoke, simple, direct, without any trace of boasting or self-importance. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just sharing his story. Thompson described his experiences in boot camp, how the rigorous training had transformed him from a naive teenager into a soldier. He talked about the camaraderie he found with his fellow soldiers, how they relied on each other during the long, grueling months in the jungle, where the heat was oppressive and the danger was constant. "We were scared most of the time," Thompson said quietly, his eyes scanning the room. "No one likes to admit it, but we were. You never knew when the enemy would attack, or where they'd come from. But you had to keep going. You had to keep your wits about you. Not just for your own sake, but for the guys next to you." The room was completely silent. Even the students who usually whispered and passed notes during class were hanging on to his every word. Jake's chest tightened as Thompson spoke about losing friends in combat, how the horror of war wasn't in the movies, but in the quiet moments after an ambush, when you realized someone who had been laughing with you the night before wasn't going to make it home. Thompson's voice never wavered, but there was a weight behind every word he said, a gravity that Jake couldn't shake. "War teaches you things you don't expect," Thompson continued. "It teaches you about sacrifice, about brotherhood. But it also teaches you about humility. You realize how small you are in the grand scheme of things, how fragile life is. And when you come home, if you're lucky enough to come home, you see the world differently. You appreciate the little things, the quiet moments, the people around you." Jake's stomach twisted. His mind flashed back to all the times he'd mocked Thompson, to the way he and his friends had laughed at him just for doing his job. Suddenly, it all felt so small, so stupid. Thompson had survived something Jake could barely comprehend, and here Jake had been, acting like a spoiled child, believing that his own achievements on the basketball court somehow made him important. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, the students filed out of the room slowly, as if they were unsure how to return to their normal routine after hearing such a powerful story. Jake lingered in his seat, watching as Thompson quietly thanked Mrs. Freeman and made his way to the door. He didn't stay to bask in any applause or accolades. He simply went back to his work, as if nothing had changed. But for Jake, everything had changed. That afternoon, Jake couldn't focus during basketball practice. His mind kept replaying Thompson's words, the images of the war-torn jungles, the fear and sacrifice Thompson had described. He barely registered his coach's instructions, his shots falling short, his passes off target. "Mitchell, what's going on with you today?" Coach called out, his tone a mix of frustration and concern. "You're off your game." Jake mumbled an apology and tried to focus, but it was no use. His heart wasn't in it. After practice, as the sun began to set, Jake found himself wandering the empty halls of the school. The building was quiet now, the usual after-school rush long gone. He didn't really know why, but he found himself heading toward the janitor's closet, where he knew Thompson would be finishing up his work for the day. When he reached the closet, he saw Thompson putting away his cleaning supplies, his back turned. Jake hesitated, suddenly unsure of himself. How did you apologize to someone you had treated so poorly? How did you make up for days, weeks, even years of arrogance and ignorance? Taking a deep breath, Jake stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson," he called out, his voice quieter than usual. Thompson turned, his expression calm as always. "Jake," he said with a nod. "What can I do for you?" Jake swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words before he even spoke them. I wanted to say I'm sorry," he began, his voice shaky. "For the things I said the other day. For all the times I was a jerk." Thompson studied him for a moment, his face unreadable. Jake braced himself for a lecture, for some kind of punishment or reprimand, but it never came. Instead, Thompson gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Apology accepted," he said softly. "But remember, Jake, respect isn't about what someone does for a living. It's about who they are, the choices they make, and how they treat others. That's a lesson you'll learn eventually, whether life teaches it to you the easy way or the hard way." Jake felt his face flush with embarrassment, but at the same time, there was a sense of relief. He nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "I get that now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thompson smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. "Good," he replied. "It's a lesson worth learning." As Jake walked away, he felt something inside him shift. The world felt a little bigger, his place in it a little smaller. He realized that being a man wasn't about standing on top of the world or being admired by everyone around you. It was about how you treated the people who helped you get there. And for the first time, Jake understood that true respect had to be earned, not given. Over the next few weeks, Jake found himself seeing the world through a different lens. He still played basketball, still hung out with his friends, but something had changed. He noticed the people around him more, the ones who often went unnoticed. The janitors, the cafeteria workers, the shy freshmen who always sat alone in the corner of the cafeteria. He made a point to say hello to them, to treat them with the respect they deserved, something he hadn't done before. His friends noticed the change too. "Jake, what's up with you lately?" Carter asked one afternoon after school. "You've been acting weird. Like you're not ripping on people anymore." Jake shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I guess I just realized some things," he replied, thinking back to Thompson's quiet strength and the life lessons the janitor had imparted, not with grand gestures or speeches, but through the simple act of living his truth. And every time Jake passed Mr. Thompson in the hallway, they exchanged a nod, a quiet acknowledgement of the understanding they now shared. For the first time in his life, Jake Mitchell was learning what it meant to truly be a man.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.